Ever since I was a young boy, I have always loved the sound of a banjo. Now, this becomes remarkable when you realize that my grandfather's radio blasted Rocky Top at 5 o'clock in the morning every weekday as WFMX Radio began its broadcast day in Statesville, North Carolina. By the time I was a senior in high school, I was playing guitar, but I got serious about finding someone to teach me banjo. Found a guy at a music store up in Greensboro. He was a very nice man, but he turned out to be more of a Kingston Trio guy rather than a bluegrass guy. So I am learning Irish folk songs when what I wanted was Foggy Mountain Breakdown. Well, one Saturday I'm there, I'm waiting for a lesson, and I hear someone playing a banjo in another room, and they are wearing it out. And I followed my ear around the corner to a practice room with an open door. Here sits this guy, late 20s, a little bit of a receding hairline, and he is wailing away. His fingers are flying up and down the neck. He's playing chords upon chords. He's making sounds from that come out of that banjo that I'd never heard before. His name was Dave Osborne, and he was the real deal. He could play any instrument with a string on it, had played on the road for years, had recorded sessions in LA and Nashville, worked the Grand Ole Opry. But at the end of the day, he was a good old boy who grew up there in Greensboro, and he had moved back recently, was trying to get a small music business going. Would he consider teaching me to play banjo? Oh yeah. He gave me a business card that said, Out a Ways Music, Dave Osborne, proprietor. Now, Out a Ways Music was out a ways. It was way down Highway 70, and it was just a cement block building where Dave stored a few instruments that he traded and sold. But I started taking banjo lessons from him out there over the course of that summer, and we always sat around afterwards just shooting the breeze for an hour or more. Dave told great stories. He told about the boarding house that he lived in when he first moved to Nashville. It was run by this little tiny woman named Miss Mamie, and she drank 6.5-ounce bottles of Coke from the time she got up in the morning till she went to bed at night. And she had 6 rooms that she rented out by the week, and she only rented to musicians and songwriters. Chris Christopherson, Merle Haggard, Willie Nelson had all passed through there. Or Dave told about the time when they were rehearsing for the Merv Griffin show out at Desilu Studios in California. All the musicians had their parts down cold. Dave was playing bass, and he had a wireless rig. So he's just up wandering around the set while he's playing his part. And he stepped onto the set behind them, and shazam! I mean, golly, he's in Mayberry. It was the soundstage to the Andy Griffith show, where they recorded all of the interior scenes. Dave played the last 2 songs of that set, sitting in Floyd's barber chair. And he told about the time about 6 months earlier when he was in Nashville packing to go out on the road, and he got a call from his sister who said that his stepfather had died suddenly, and his mother was not dealing with it very well. And just like that, Dave sold or gave away most of his gear, moved back to Greensboro to help take care of his mom. Now, at that point, I am playing a harmony banjo. Now, harmony banjos are made of the finest grade of hard plastic that money can buy. It was a cheap banjo, but it was good enough to learn on. Well, at the very end of that summer, Dave took me with him to a music wholesaler, and he left me in the parking lot while he went inside. In a little bit, he comes out with a Morris banjo, which is kind of a mid-level banjo, but way better than the one I had. And he opens it up across the tailgate of his station wagon, and it had this pretty little pearl inlay of a double eagle spread on the back of the resonator. And Dave says, "Do you like it?" And I said, "I love it." And Dave told me what he paid for it. And then he said, "Pay me back when you have it, old son." He always called me old son, and I have no idea why. I would sometimes call him Brother Dave, but that was just fun. Well, that fall, I started school there, and I moved into a dorm in Greensboro. Dave took on a 3rd shift job, still saving money to open his music store. We saw each other pretty often at that point. Dave was playing with a band in town, and I would go out to hear him. As I got halfway decent and I was playing guitar and banjo with different groups, Dave would come to hear me. And afterwards, we always spent way too much time sitting in greasy spoon restaurants drinking way too much coffee. We talked about anything and everything. Classes I was taking, his progress on getting a store open, girls I liked, girls he liked, whether disco was really music, it didn't matter. At that point, I knew if I told Dave anything in confidence, he would take it to his grave, and he knew the same about me. Well, one afternoon, I'm coming out of psych class, and there's Dave leaning against his station wagon, and he is grinning like a possum. So I walked over, and he says, "Come on, I want to show you something." So we get in his car, and we drove down Spring Garden Street about 4 blocks, and he parks in front of Monette's Carpet Emporium. And it's a big old house that's been converted into a store. It has plate glass windows that run all the way across the front. And in the window, there's a big sign that says, "Going out of business, sell. Everything must go." And Dave says, "Well, what do you think, old son?" And of course, he had just bought the place, and Dave had his music store. And I said, "Well, what are you going to call it?" And Dave says, "The Music Barn." And so he did. One of the coolest things about the Music Barn, it was every Saturday afternoon, they had a come one, come all jam session. And the coolest thing to me was always the mix of people. You would have a 13-year-old girl just learning to play mandolin, standing next to an 80-year-old man who didn't play anything anymore, but he could still sing the Dickens out of Rank Strangers. It was a magical place. Well, toward the end of my college days, I told Dave that I had decided to move to Nashville and give it a shot as a songwriter. And Dave says, "Well, it's about time. When do we leave, old son?" And so before I actually moved to Nashville, Dave and I made a trip up just to check things out. He took me to the boarding house where he'd stayed. Miss Mamie was still there, still had crates of 6.5 ounces Cokes in her kitchen. Dave got us backstage to the Opry. I got to meet Earl Scruggs. These are all stories for another time. Well, I was in Nashville for 10 years. Then I moved around a bit, wound up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I'd still go see Dave anytime I was in Greensboro. We made a point to call each other on our birthdays and once in a while otherwise. Well, late one afternoon, I get a call from Dave's niece, Dina, who I hadn't seen in 30 years. She said that Dave had had a stroke, that he was in Moses Cone Hospital there in Greensboro. She didn't know how serious it was, that he was still pretty sedated. Well, I threw some things together and made that long drive from Fort Lauderdale to Greensboro, and his family got me back in his room about 8 o'clock the next morning. And they said that Dave had been using the gym and sauna over to Moose Lodge, and he drove home afterwards and got there, but he never made it in from his car. His sister happened to be passing by and noticed his driver door was flung open, so she stopped and dialed 911. Dave had been awake for a short while the night before, but he was just completely out of his head talking nonsense. So we're all standing around waiting on Dave to wake up. A doctor comes in, checks Dave over a little bit, and sure enough, Dave opens his eyes. And the doctor says, "How are you feeling?" And Dave says, "Not too bad." And the doctor says, "There's a whole lot of people here waiting to see you. Do you know who these people are?" Dave went right down the line. "That's my sister, that's my brother-in-law, that's my nephew." When he got to me, he paused and he squinted. And then he said, "And that's my best friend. Hello, old son." Dave has come a long way since that night. There are gaps, but he still tells great stories, and he has the same sense of humor that I have loved for all these years. The Music Barn is still there, 40 some years now. Dave's nephew runs the place, but Dave gets up and goes into work 5 days a week. If you are ever in Greensboro, North Carolina, stop by the Music Barn. If Dave is there, go back and visit with him. He will be glad to meet you, and he will make you glad to have met him. Oh, and if you think of it, tell him that old son sends his love.